Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of the ICBA. Welcome to our webinar, Activating Your .bank domain name. The next steps once you have secured and verified your .bank name. I'd like to remind you that a copy of these slides can be found and downloaded at encirca.com/ICBA. Simply click on the webinar link in the top header of the website. And these will be our presenters for this afternoon. We'll start with Viveka Ware, ICBA Executive Vice President, responsible for regulatory policy for the ICBA and board member of FTLD Registry. We also have Craig Schwartz, FTLD Registry Managing Director, managing .bank and .insurance domain registries. He is former Chief Registry Liaison with ICANN. We also have Rob Holmes, Return Path General Manager, responsible for email fraud protection services, previously at leading service providers in the DNS and brand protection industry. And then finally, we have Thomas Barrett, INCIRCA President. INCIRCA is the sole registrar serving on .bank's Security Requirements Working Group. It was founded in 2001 in Boston, Massachusetts. And this will be our agenda for the webinar today. We'll start off with why you should move to .bank. Go on to .bank status updates, and then we'll discuss DMARC and .bank, and finally .bank migration strategies. If at any point you do have any questions on the material presented, please enter your questions into the question box of your GoToWebinar widget. We will hold all questions till the end of the webinar, and then we will answer them all. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Viveka Ware on ICBA's role in .bank.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your ongoing support of ICBA. ICBA is thrilled about the community banking industry's participation in the .bank domain. ICBA is a strong advocate of the financial services industry having a more secure channel to conduct online financial transactions. Serving as a founder, investor, and endorser of FTLD Registry, the registry operator for .bank and .insurance is another facet of our advocacy. With the interest of community banks first and foremost, ICBA decided to establish an alliance with a registrar to ensure community banks receive the information, service, and support they need to prosper in this new and dynamic environment. And we're very pleased to be working with INCIRCA. We are continuing our relationship with INCIRCA with a new focus on banks' activation of their .bank domain name. Be sure to visit www.incirca.com/ICBA for the latest information and resources regarding .bank. So now you've registered for .bank. I assume that most of you on the call have already done so. So why should you move to .bank? First of all, .bank was created by the banks for banks. .bank is owned, operated, and governed by the financial services community. .bank is a trusted, verified, and more secure online location for banking services. Due to FTLD Registry's design, policies, and enhanced security requirements, only verified members of the global banking community are eligible to register for .bank. .bank's design addresses the root causes of online banking fraud. .bank reduces the risk, incidence, and scope of phishing and spoofing. .bank eliminates cyber squatting due to the requirement that domains must correspond to legal names. This structure well positions FTLD Registry to proactively implement strategies in the best interest of the industry and its customers. .bank establishes a solid foundation on which a bank can securely communicate with customers, stakeholders, and regulators. As you know, the security bar is much higher for financial institutions than other companies conducting business over the Internet, given their roles as trusted financial intermediaries or their customers. These are all compelling reasons to move to .bank. So one question that we've gotten quite frequently is, why is .bank so expensive? Well, it's very important to recognize that FTLD's operations are far more expensive than most new and existing Internet registry operators. For example, the verification process undertaken by Symantec to ensure that only legitimate banks are awarded domain names is a costly and time-consuming process. Then you have VeriSign, FTLD's technical services provider, who's responsible for ensuring compliance with some of the enhanced security requirements, and there are extra costs associated with their role. Then there's another third-party service provider that's responsible for monitoring for any abusive use of .bank domains, such as spam or malware, and compliance by banks with the enhanced security requirements. So basically, we're committed to making sure that .bank performs as presented, and of course that requires a very complex behind-the-scenes operation that does involve significant funds. So basically, .bank domain names can only be registered at the approved registrars, currently 22, that agree to adopt the security standards required by FTLD registry. Adoption requires significant effort and expense, which is why there are a limited number of registrars. Consequently, a $1,000 .bank domain is not simply replacing a $30 .com domain. Now I'm very pleased to hand off the program to Craig Swartz, who is FTLD Registry Managing Director. And Craig, we certainly appreciate your ongoing participation in the ICBA and Encirca educational series. Craig, it's all yours.
Thank you, Viveka, and thanks to Encirca for hosting another webinar for ICBA members. If we can move to the next slide. So the purpose of this is to give you some sense of what the activity and the volume has been in .bank so far, and it has, from our perspective, far exceeded our early expectations. We're up to a little bit more than 5,700 registered domain names as of yesterday, and that's representative of about 2,250 or 2,300 individual banks. So we are seeing some banks are registering more than one domain name. Of the total number of registrations, we do have representation from 44 countries, but currently the vast majority of registrations are, in fact, from the United States. If we look at the status breakdown and where these are, and some folks on the call may already have been approved and gone through the verification process, or you may actually be pending the verification process by Symantec. As of yesterday, there are about 2,700 pending verification. That number is actually going to come down by a couple of hundred after today. So the verifications completed will actually jump to around 3,300 by this evening. We're seeing a very high approval rate for the domains, which is due in part to the good work that registrars like Encirca are doing with pre-verifying registrants before they apply for domain names. And I'd also like to think that all of the communicating that FTLD and ICBA and other trade organizations have done about the process has made it really clear for banks on how to participate. All that being said, and with the great numbers, we are still seeing some issues completing verifications. Part of it is due to the sheer volume of registration requests that we received on June 24th when the general availability period opened, and literally in the first 10 minutes of operations we got more than 3,000 applications. So the volume overall is much greater than expected, which is taking Symantec a long time to complete their verification. However, even with that volume, we're still seeing that Symantec is having a hard time verifying employment and authority with the bank. And this process involves a phone call to the bank's HR department or the manager of the contact person associated with the order. And whether the HR manager or manager is not getting the phone call or they're not getting the email, Symantec shared with us that it's sometimes taking quite a bit of time to get connected with the right person in order to complete the verification. We also are still seeing a fair number of registrations from bank holding companies, and bank holding companies are currently not eligible for domain names in .bank. What we do enable, and this is subject to a use restriction, is that given the relationship between a bank holding company and its regulated banking subsidiary, we do permit a regulated banking entity to register a domain name on behalf of its bank holding company that is the name of the bank holding company. However, because the holding companies themselves are not eligible, we do place a use restriction on that, in that that domain cannot be used by anyone other than the eligible banking entity. And when we've communicated that restriction to some of our applicants, they've said we still want the name and please process it, and others have said we're going to let it go and please delete it. So it's really up to the bank to determine what it would like to do with those domains. Next slide, please. To assist banks in determining what their strategy is around implementation of their .bank domain or domains, in June we published a guide to leveraging .bank, and you can see the URL that's been provided. It's a pretty hefty document that is comprised of 3 different topic areas. The first being how to communicate to internal and external stakeholders about your planned use of your .bank domain. The second section is focused on messaging the security requirements to a CTO, CISO, CIO level employee within the bank. And the third section is a much more detailed description of what the security requirements are, some best practices for implementation, and we published the guide to help banks figure out what to do and how to do it. And depending on the complexity and ability of your internal IT department, they may be able to take the guide themselves and move forward with this. For those of you, and I suspect there are many on the call that do rely on third-party service providers, whether it's an FIS or a First Data or a Jack Henry and any one of the number of other technology service providers, this is certainly a document that can be shared with them, or they can easily download a copy of it themselves. Through yesterday, we've had about 1,100 requests for the guide, so we're glad to see that it's getting out into the hands of folks that need it. To highlight some key points, your domain name will not resolve until it's been verified and set up correctly. And even at that, it still needs to be in compliance with all of our security requirements. The DNSSEC and .bank name server piece, which Tom may hit upon a little bit later in his presentation or his part of the talk, are the minimum requirements for having your domain name work on the Internet. That being said, there still need to be other elements in place, such as the following bullet, which is TLS or SSL, or transport layer security and secure sockets layer, which is an encryption standard or an encryption practice. And as noted on the slide, even if you want to, for the near term, redirect or forward your .bank domain to your .com web address, which is permissible currently, the .bank domain itself needs to be completely compliant, including this TLS SSL feature. In terms of the DMARC alignment, which is all about our email authentication piece, and Rob is going to get into much greater detail about this, DMARC does need to be in place if you're going to have your name resolved, and whether or not you're going to be using it for email, there still is a DMARC requirement. If you do use your domain name for email services, there are additional requirements, And again, Rob will speak to that in much greater detail shortly. And I think that concludes my portion. I'll turn it back over to Rob Holmes, who's going to get into the DMARC and .bank discussion. Rob?
Thanks very much, Craig, and thanks to the ICBA and INCIRCA for inviting me to present. Yeah, so Craig kind of gave you an overview, and I think we talked about DNS and SSL as being quite widely understood technologies. But DMARC is probably a bit of a new one for many of you. So I wanted to kind of crisply articulate why DMARC is important and what it really does. And before we get technical, we'll just give you an example of precisely what DMARC does. So this is an example of a phishing scam, the likes of which many of you will be familiar with. And you can see at the top, if we zoom in on that address, we can see that it's actually come from an address of secure-owens at firstcitizensonline.com. And firstcitizensonline.com is actually owned by First Citizens Bank. So this is a phishing scam that has actually come from an address that has been spoofed to precisely match the email address of the bank that it is looking to target. Now this is a very particularly credible threat, and in fact if we click through to the visual of the website that it goes to as well, we can see that it's a very, very compelling and therefore dangerous threat. So succinctly put, DMARC would block this email, would prevent it from even being delivered at the major mailboxes in the world. So DMARC has about 85% consumer mailbox coverage in the United States, including Gmail and Yahoo and Hotmail and AOL. And so if this email was received and it come from a .bank address, it would have got blocked. So Craig nicely described and Viveka described kind of the umbrella protection and trust and security of .bank, and DMARC gives .bank security teeth in the email world. So that's those are the types of threats that DMARC will address. And if we go through to the next slide, I'll give you a little more detail. So DMARC, what is it? It stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. So domain-based because of the fact that in the last example, the domain was spoofed. The message authentication is that it will authenticate the identity of the sender, and if it was not First Citizens Bank, then it would have got blocked. The reporting element is a great feature of DMARC because it actually informs you, the owner of that domain. It actually gives you visibility into precisely who is pretending to send email in your name. It also can help with email governance, which is a little side point. It can help you see how your marketing emails are going out and your transactional emails are going out. It is an open email authentication standard. It was launched in February 2012, so it is widely adopted by many of the biggest banks in the world and retail companies and social media companies. It was pioneered by various companies, including Bank of America, Google, and indeed ReturnPath. In a nutshell, it really provides domain owners with two things. It provides domain owners with control and intelligence. It provides you with the control to block domain-based spoofing, the likes of which I just showed you, and it provides intelligence through its reporting mechanism. So we'll dive now into a little bit more detail about how it empowers you. So DMARC really instructs mailbox providers how to handle emails that fail authentication. So in the event that Gmail received that email in that first place, DMARC tells Gmail what to do with it. And there are three what we call policy settings. So we can instruct, using the DMARC protocol, we can instruct Gmail to do nothing other than report on it. That is the none setting. That will, in that event, Gmail would send us data, but the fact that it failed authentication would not influence their delivery decision. The next status is quarantine. That would instruct Gmail to send that email to a spam folder or flag it as potentially fraudulent or put it in junk. And the final setting, which is the strongest setting, it is the most hardened setting of DMARC, is reject. And with reject, Gmail would not even put that email in a junk folder. It would be complete elimination of risk. And the great thing about .bank is that really it drives owners of .bank to implement that reject policy. So on the next slide, we'll just drill down a little bit further and talk about specifically with regards to .bank, what are the security requirements as it relates to DMARC and eliminating email fraud. And I won't go into all of the details. I will really focus on the first and the last bullets here. So first up, registrants, you as an owner of a .bank, must publish a valid DMARC record, and that is done in the DNS. And it must be with a policy of either quarantine or reject by default. Okay, so you will be required to publish a DMARC record. It is mandated by FTLD. And the fact that it's a quarantine and reject means that those fraudulent emails will, by default, go to a spam folder or even, best case scenario, get rejected out of hand. Now, the only exception to that is the fourth bullet, is that when deploying DMARC, you as the owner of a .bank may temporarily use a policy of none during the implementation phase. And I'll explain why that's important. The thing about authentication standards is that if your legitimate email fails the authentication standard, then your legitimate email would also get blocked. So using the none policy during implementation affords owners of .bank a period of time to check that their legitimate email is authenticating correctly without the risk of blocking legitimate email. So just to reiterate, when deploying DMARC, we can roll the policy back from reject or quarantine to a policy of none to ensure that DMARC is in no way affecting negatively the delivery of your legitimate email. So there are some other details that we go into, but I think for at this point in time, that's probably a sufficient level of detail. So I think at this point, we'll move on to the next slide, and I think I will be just wrapping up by summarizing that without DMARC, there is nothing to prevent those spoofed emails getting delivered. And really that DMARC ensures that only your legitimate email can come from your .bank address. Everything else gets blocked before it reaches the intended victim. So it's elimination of phishing. So at this point, I'll hand over to Tom. He's going to talk a little bit about migrating to .bank.
Thank you, Rob. Can we go to the next slide, please? I do recommend that you download the guide that FTLD has put on their website. And what it really describes is that you need to have a plan that really lays out all the different steps you need to do to migrate to .bank. For many of you, .bank, just adopting a .bank name is a new branding exercise and something that needs to be communicated to your customers, to your employees, to your partners. It may require changes to your stationery, your signage. So it's not just a website and email issue. We are suggesting that you do a staged migration in terms of near term, putting up a landing page Again, we do not require or we do not necessarily recommend web forwarding. I'll explain why in a second. But we think a landing page is a good first step to make sure that you are in compliance for the DNS security standards for .bank. And then that allows you to start the technology migration while you're starting to communicate what's going on to your various stakeholder groups. So let's talk about some of the technology considerations. Let's go to the next page, please. To be clear, there is no clock ticking right now. You're not forced to actually use your .bank domain name, but clearly I think you made this investment already, and you understand that the benefit of adopting .bank means that the potential for fraud on your bank or your customers is greatly diminished. But certainly you have time to put together a plan to decide how you want to do this migration. Some banks have already migrated their website but have not yet done their email. You're certainly allowed to run both your existing website and your new .bank website in parallel for as long as you want to make sure your customers are eased through the transition. The registry currently is saying that web forwarding is allowed. However, it still must use SSL or TLS encryption. And in fact, we have seen some banks who are doing forwarding and not doing it correctly. And that's really because if they're relying on their DNS provider to do their web forwarding, most DNS providers that I know of do not do web forwarding using data encryption. And so you will not be in compliant if your DNS provider is doing the web forwarding for you. Furthermore, the registry is suggesting that this policy is being reviewed right now and may be revised in the fall. At the very least, if you plan to do a redirect, you should be telling your end users that they are leaving the secure .bank zone and going to a .com, in most cases, zone, which has a different set of potential security standards that are being applied. We have one other suggestion, in addition to suggesting that you do not use web forwarding. We're also suggesting that if you haven't already applied DMARC policy to your existing .com website, then we suggest you get into DMARC alignment before you try to migrate your email addresses to .bank. That will facilitate your migration if you can take care of that first. Next slide, please. So we have the name server activation. As we've told you in previous webinars, INCIRCA is offering free setup of the DNS for all of its customers. And this ensures that you're in compliance with the standards to have the name servers using a .bank domain name. And in fact, we will be using your own .bank domain name to set up those name servers. It will have DNSSEC enabled and fully signed at the registry. It will have a fully compliant DMARC record set up automatically, and it will be set to reject initially, which indicates that you're not yet using this .bank domain name to send out email. In addition to the free setup, we're offering a free 3-month trial of that service. And since we're not recommending you do web forwarding of the name, we are going to also include a SSL-enabled landing page so that your name will resolve in the browser, and end users who find it will have a way to find your existing website. We want to provide 2 useful links here. The first one is the registry whois, and you can use this for not only to determine the status of your domain name. So if you're wondering, where am I in the verification process? Have I completed it yet or not? If you are still pending verification, you will see a status that says pending create. So your name is secure while you're going through this particular verification process. That Whois will also show you if there's DNS set up. You can see the name server names. The second link here is a way to verify that DNSSEC is set up correctly on your name servers. And so these links work even no matter who your DNS provider is or who your registrar is. You can go to these two links and do those checks on your domain name. Next slide, please. So here's the example of the landing page that we will be providing as part of the setup of the DNS for your domain name. As you see here, we basically are saying it's a future home of this name. Click here to visit our existing website. And it is SSL enabled, which is the requirement for .bank. If we simply redirected this to the existing .com website without some custom programming, it would not be, and making sure it had SSL on it, would not be in compliant with the security standards, and the security police would come calling. So rather than risk that particular problem, we're suggesting here's how you can get your name resolving. You can still promote it. Clients can still find your existing website, but you can also make sure that you're in compliance with the security standards. Next slide, please. So in terms of DMARC that Rob described to you, there are several options. This is something which you can do yourself if you feel like you have a qualified technical person on staff or available for your use. All they need to do is update the DNS record, which we're setting up, and they can insert their own email address, and then they remove the reject flag to none, as Rob explained earlier, and very soon all of the various email providers such as Google, AOL, Yahoo would start sending XML reports to the email address that's been identified in that DMARC record. And so that's a do-it-yourself option, which all of you have. A second option is a do-it-yourself with a reporting service, such as from Return Path. And what this does, it allows you to take this XML data, which for many of us looks like gibberish, and will format it into something that's readable and actionable, so you can interpret what Google and AOL and Microsoft are trying to say in these reports. But it's still it's incumbent on the recipient of those reports to understand what they're saying. Typically, they are translating that to set up, say, an SPF record and whitelisting the various authorized senders that they're using to send out email. And then finally, there is a completely outsourced option where we provide a vendor such as Return Path to not only receive those reports, but also complete a full audit of who are the authorized senders of email for your bank, what are their IP addresses that we need to whitelist so that we can make sure that the industry or the internet knows who the authorized senders of email are for this bank. And once you complete that process, you change the DMARC flag from none back to reject so that only the authorized email is accepted by email providers. So obviously right now, since no one's using .bank, there is no email traffic. And so you're already using your .com for email. And our recommendation is if you have not already set up DMARC and SPF or DKIM for your existing email, then you take care of that as part of this migration process. And once you have your DMARC alignment working for your .com, your migration of that email to your .bank is goes a much more smoother process. So here are some interesting, useful links once you start this process. So for example, the standards body for DMARC is dmarc.org, and you can see the link there to look at the deployment tools for DMARC. If you want to find out if you are already using DMARC for your existing email addresses, you can go to the DMARC record validator at the link shown, put in your current .com domain name, and it will tell you if there's a DMARC record set up for that. You also likewise can check to see if there's an SPF record or a DKIM record already set up for your domain name. So that's our talk for today. We certainly, the reason why we invited ReturnPath on the panel today is they are the experts in DMARC, and working with them, we have developed a suite of services to help banks who either want the reporting service or would like a domain name audit, and we can help you migrate and achieve DMARC alignment for both your .bank and your .com domain names. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Tom. At this point, I'd like to open it up to some questions that we had throughout the webinar. We'll start off with verification question. For banks that have not been verified yet, is there any form of contact that they will receive if Symantec is having trouble getting in touch with the HR department or the supervisor?
So this is Craig, and my understanding is that if Symantec is having a difficult time reaching the contact to do the verification, that they will email the contact associated with the registration. So there should be some communication from them about their inability to complete the verification.
Great, thank you. And going on to hosting .bank websites, are there any specific requirements for hosting companies to launch a .bank site?
So I can take this a little bit, Tom, and if you want to jump in too. So all of the requirements for .bank domains are associated with the domain name itself. And to the extent that your domain name is compliant, then you choose to host a website on it. To the extent that the hosting company helps you provide any of the services or runs your DNS and or runs your name servers, there may be implications for them in that capacity. But at the end of the day, the security requirements are associated with the domain name, and then subsequent to that, your website is hosted on that domain name. Tom may have more to add on that one.
Right. So one of the core requirements for .bank is that the DNS name servers must end in .bank. And so you can certainly talk to your web hosting provider and say, are you able to set up vanity name servers for us that end in .bank? Let's assume that your web hosting provider does not already qualify for .bank, very few do, and so they would use your own domain name to set up those vanity name servers. If they do not, if they're not able to do that, or if they want to charge you $1,000 for that, which we've heard from some of our customers, you can use another option to do your DNS. So, for example, you can use Encirca. Our charge for this is a free setup with a $200 annual fee. And then what you do is you change something called the A record. Initially, we set our A record to simply point to that landing page we showed you earlier. But it's real simple, no charge to simply change that A record to point to your web hosting provider who you want to host your website. And we've already made sure that the DNS is fully compliant.
Okay, and regarding DMARC, Rob, you mentioned that a DMARC record must be published. Where do banks publish this DMARC record?
In the authoritative DNS for your .bank, or of course your .com. Tom nicely described earlier, we would strongly encourage people to start the authentication process on your existing email infrastructure, your .com. Most of the people on the line will be using. Yeah, it needs to be hosted in the DNS. It's a simple TXT record. And certainly, I think that you'll all have the opportunity to submit an inquiry to Encirca where they can give you very specific requirements as to what that DNS record looks like. But it's a simple TXT record in the authoritative DNS for your domain.
And just for clarification purposes, if a bank does not plan on using their .bank domain name right away, they can use their DMARC for their .com?
Absolutely, yes. It's an open standard. As I said earlier, it's the domain-based message authentication. That domain can be the D of DMARC. It can be any domain. .bank mandates it, I think rightly so, for the greater protection of the community. But .com, whilst it does not mandate it, DMARC can be deployed on .com, absolutely. And users would derive the same benefits in terms of fraudulent email being blocked. The beauty of .bank is couple that with the strict eligibility criteria in registration means that you don't get cyber squatting as well. You don't get people registering variations of your domain in .bank. And so I think that you get much greater protection from DMARC in .bank. But absolutely you can deploy it on your .com.
Excellent, thank you. And is DMARC alignment included in Encirca's DNS service that they're offering for 3 months?
So our initial DNS setup would include a DMARC record. The record would be set up so that the flag is set to reject. And so that is compliant with the .bank standard. And what it means is that you're not using that domain name to send out email. DMARC alignment is not included, and that involves you either become aligned via SPF or DKIM. SPF basically means you have to take an inventory of all the third-party systems that the bank uses to send out email. So for example, you might use Salesforce.com, you might use Constant Contact. Some banks larger banks might have quite a few of these, and you need to identify, okay, here are all the authorized senders of email for my bank. You need to capture their IP addresses, and that becomes a whitelist of authorized senders. And once you have that list, you're basically communicating to the world, if you receive any email from our bank, it has to be from one of these list of IP addresses, and if it's not, reject that email. So going through that process is not part of our DNS setup. That's a value-added service that we are offering in conjunction with ReturnPath.
And regarding the quarantine mail, where does it go? And how does that coincide with current spam filters that banks may have on their email servers?
So to be clear, DMARC has currently been adopted on the receiver side. That's to say, the people actually hosting the customer, the receiver of the email. The main people who have adopted it are Hotmail, Outlook, Gmail, Yahoo, AOL. So the consumer mailbox providers. And so in that context, if an email was received by one of those mailbox providers and it failed DMARC and there was a quarantine policy, then it would be put into a junk folder or spam or potentially marked as fraudulent. Now, I think what the question alluded to was, well, how does that relate? What happens if that fraudulent email is going to an organization, not a user at Hotmail or Yahoo? Now that will very much depend on the email filter that is receiving that email and processing it. So some organizations actually use Gmail as their Gmail apps, as their email system. And of course, Gmail supports DMARC, and so in that sense, that fraudulent email would get put in spam, put in junk, or marked as potentially fraudulent. There are also some email gateway security providers, such as Cisco, the latest version thereof, and Dell SonicWall, that will also have also implemented DMARC. And in that case, yeah, again, if there was a quarantine in place, that email would get put into spam. However, on the inbound, as I was describing, kind of protecting the enterprise from these types of phishing attacks, there are still some gaps in adoption. So Symantec being an example of a leading email security gateway provider who is in the process of implementing DMARC on the receiving side. Right now, there are still some controls in place, but they are going to look at more things like the fingerprints of the email, the kind of clues within the email. But that's the challenge, and that's why DMARC is so great, is that if I receive an email without DMARC, it's very difficult for me to know whether the sender really is who they say they are. And so if I don't really know whether the sender is who they say they are, then I have to make my best guess, and that is going to be based on potentially IP address reputation or heuristics, looking at the content of the email, but it's prone to error. Sorry, that was quite a long-winded answer, but I think the quick answer is that in the consumer mailbox world, it'll get put into a spam folder, and on the inbound, enterprise level, that will depend.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. That was very thorough. Regarding compliance for .bank, we have a bank that plans on hosting a login on their .bank site, which will then direct their customers to a .com site outsourced by a third party. Does this present any issues in compliance?
Andrew, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. So online banking is outsourced through a third party and will still be a .com site. However, the login page will be hosted on a .bank website.
So the way I understand that frequently happens is that there's a CNAME to the service provider's URL where that service is hosted, and what will need to happen in .bank is that you can CNAME from a .bank URL to another .bank URL, but you can't CNAME from a .bank URL to a .com URL. So for those entities that are hosting these services and where the CNAME feature is used, either those entities will have to have .bank names if they qualify, and the most common service providers here in the United States, the First Data, the Fiservs, the Jack Henrys, they all qualify for domain names in .bank, which is how they can support their customers. If that's not possible, it's certainly conceivable that a bank could allocate the use of their name to their service provider. So if I'm anybank.bank, then it could be that the service provider runs serviceprovider.anybank.bank. So there is some complexity involved, and there are compliance items associated with how you get from a .bank URL to a .com URL.
Thank you, Craig. And just for clarification purposes, I heard you mention that some parties, such as Pfizer, can move to a .bank and are eligible.
Right. One of the eligibility categories for .bank are what are called service providers, and we enable service providers to register .bank names solely to enable them to provide infrastructure services to their banking customers. It's not for marketing. It's not for changing serviceprovider.com to serviceprovider.bank, but it's to enable those providers to continue to provide the services that they do to their customers. And whether it's a bill payment feature or online account sign-up or online banking, those are some of the examples where those service providers tend to operate.
Excellent. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have for today. For the next steps, you can start the planning process by visiting register.bank/guide and view the whole planning guide issued by FTLD Registry. If you'd like to get started for DNS and DMARC, you can sign up at encirca.com/ICBA. All general inquiries and callback requests can be emailed to icba@encirca.com. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to thank the panelists, Craig, Viveka, Rob, and Thomas. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.